Hi, everybody. Tonight, we begin a story both strange and serene, winding its way through the shifting sands of memory, where ancient shadows move in silence and secrets sleep beneath the Nile. This tale speaks of sacred rituals and whispered chants, of forgotten gardens blooming with curious herbs, and of minds lifted high beyond the veil of waking thought. The ancient Egyptians, with all their knowledge of life and death, of stars and spirits, also knew how to journey inward, farther than one might dare imagine. Some say they walked among gods in trance-like states, their feet never leaving the ground. Others say their temples were filled not only with incense but with something more mysterious. And so, with a slow breath and an open heart, we begin. Long ago, when the river still flowed in patterns known only to the stars, and the great pyramids were still young enough to gleam like gold, there lived a priest named Hekanach. He was neither the highest among priests nor the lowest, but he bore a certain look in his eye, distant, as if always listening to something just beyond the room. Hekanach served at a lesser temple dedicated to Hathor, the Lady of Joy and Music, patroness of beauty and intoxication. This temple sat not far from Dendera, tucked against a bend in the Nile where papyrus grew thick and birds filled the air with their soft songs. The air there always smelled sweet, of honey and milk and something more subtle, something like memory. Each morning, Hekanach rose before the sun, bathed in silence, and ground herbs in preparation for the day's offerings. Among the jars and bowls that lined his chamber were substances known only to the initiated. There was blue lotus, its petals dried and curled like sleeping wings. There was mandrake root, pale and knotted like a tiny man's body, and there were leaves and powders with names long forgotten by time, their smells sharp and dizzying, their effects stranger still. On a morning when the Nile mist hung thick and the sky was the color of a worn pearl, Hekanach was summoned to the high priestess, a woman called Saori. She was a narrow, tall figure, her skin dark as cedar bark and her voice like the rustle of linen. She had lived beyond 45 summers, a rare age for her time, and the lines on her face seemed carved by the same hand that shaped the statues of the gods. Sarit led Hekanach into a chamber beneath the temple, one so ancient it predated even the walls above. There a ritual had been prepared. Bowls of blue liquid glistened on the altar, and the walls were painted with spirals and stars, strange plants and beings with wide eyes and open hands. "This is the night of open doors," she said softly. "You are ready." Hekanach's heart beat not with fear, but with a calm curiosity. He knelt beside the altar, inhaled the fumes that rose like delicate fingers, and drank what was offered. What followed was not a dream, nor quite a vision, but something in between. His body remained still, but his spirit rose, lifted not by wings but by waves. He saw a garden with no end, filled with golden trees and laughter like wind chimes. He walked among figures cloaked in light, and though they said nothing, he understood everything. He felt the earth breathe beneath him, felt time slow to a murmur, and above all he felt joy, vast and uncontainable, as though he had finally returned to a home he had forgotten he had lost. When Hekanach awoke, the candlelight flickered gently, and Sarit was gone. But something within him had shifted. From that night on, he began to record what he saw during his rituals, not as prophecies or omens, but as maps of inner lands. He called them the fields beyond the horizon. The scrolls he left behind were strange. They spoke of floating palaces, of sacred harmonies heard only in trance, of beings that looked both human and animal, and something else altogether. His handwriting grew looser, more flowing, as though it too had begun to move like the Nile. Others began to follow him. At first they were novices, curious and easily swayed, but as Hekanach refined his mixtures and meditations, even senior priests came to sit at his feet. He taught not dogma but quietude, not worship but surrender. He never claimed to speak to gods, but simply to travel where they already waited. Some came seeking healing, others sought wisdom, and some, the ones with haunted eyes, came simply to forget. For the rituals of Hathor did not judge. They offered the sweetness of forgetting and the lightness of ascent. And yet, not all looked upon these practices with warmth. In Thebes, whispers stirred. Priests of Amun, the great hidden one, began to question the ecstatic rites of Hathor's temple. They called them dangerous, frivolous, even profane. Rumors spread that Hekanok's followers had become too free, too wild, that they danced with spirits better left alone. But Hekanok himself remained calm. He smiled more often now, though always gently, as if he were remembering something just on the edge of language. He told his students that fear would always guard the gate, but behind it always was understanding. And so, while the wider world turned in cycles of politics and flood and famine, in that quiet bend of the Nile, a different world flourished, one of music and drifting minds, of sacred intoxication and remembered dreams. As time passed, the Temple of Hathor grew more lush, not in riches but in spirit. Flowers bloomed where none had been planted. Animals grew unafraid. And the people who came and went from that place always seemed to leave a little slower, a little quieter, as though carrying something invisible in their breath. But of course, nothing beautiful remains untouched forever. And though Hekanok's teaching spread like soft fire, there were those who would come to extinguish it. For the line between vision and heresy is a thin one, especially when the gods begin to whisper secrets that others have not heard. And so, our story will carry us farther through gardens and dreams, into courts and tombs, through the eyes of those who believe that heaven could be found not only above, but within. Let us rest now, and when the sand shifts again, we shall return. The days that followed Hekanok's awakening passed like water beneath a quiet reed boat, smooth, reflective, and oddly unmeasurable. Each sunrise brought with it a gentle purpose, and each sunset a fading of boundaries between what was seen and what was felt. Within the Temple of Hathor, life unfolded not in commands but in rhythms. There were daily rituals, of course, the tending of sacred fires, the singing of hymns in the courtyard, the feeding of the temple's white cat, who watched all things with unblinking gold eyes. Yet beneath these outward motions, something deeper stirred, a silent blooming, as if the temple itself had begun to breathe. Hekanok no longer feared the strange journeys he now undertook each night. The mixtures prepared beneath Seret's guidance, steeped with blue lotus, frankincense, myrrh, and the finer dusts of sacred roots, no longer clouded his mind but clarified it. As others might climb stairs, he descended softly into what he called the basin of the unseen, a gentle fall into a realm so distant and yet uncannily familiar. One evening, as dusk curled around the palm trees like silk, he was joined in the inner chamber by a visitor, a young priestess named Izara. She had traveled from far beyond Thebes, her journey driven not by duty, but by dreams. She claimed to have heard the name Hekanok whispered to her in the dark hours before dawn, in a voice not her own. She spoke not with haste, but with a measured awe, as one might describe a long-forgotten song that suddenly returned to memory. Hekanok observed her for some time before speaking. Then, with a small nod, he welcomed her into the sacred circle. That night, Isara tasted the offering, not all at once, but slowly, as if sipping from a story. Her eyes remained open for a time, then closed like petals folding at nightfall. Hekanok watched as her body stilled, her breath deepened, and her presence seemed to shift, not leave, but soften, as though she were wrapped in unseen hands. Later, when she returned, she wept quietly, not in sorrow, but with a tender bewilderment. She spoke of walking beside a great river of stars and of meeting a figure whose face was both hers and not hers. She touched my heart, Izara whispered, and it beat not once, but 100 times in a single breath. I saw my own birth and my death, and neither frightened me. Word of Izara's vision spread among the acolytes like the scent of jasmine in the warm evening. Though the priests of Hathor had always honored beauty, song, and sensation, this new practice was deeper still. It was not indulgence, but reverence, an unfolding of the soul like the petals of a flower turned toward light. Yet for every seeker drawn by curiosity, there were others moved by more desperate winds. One such man arrived in the season of high floods. His name was Menka, and he wore the blue-striped sash of a physician. His hands were steady, but his eyes bore shadows that even the sun could not lift. His daughter, a child of just 7 summers, had fallen into a stupor from which no remedy could rouse her. He had heard, through rumors passed from caravan to caravan, of the strange awakenings in the Temple of Hathor. Hekanok received him with quiet grace, asking no questions of proof or status. They led the child, wrapped in linen and herbs, into the sanctuary. There, with Isara now beside him as a silent guide, Hekanak prepared a drop that was unlike the others, gentler, woven with lullaby leaves and the rare tears of acacia resin. Menka was not permitted to join the ritual. Only the child would walk the path. And so he sat outside, his head bowed, while the chanting within rose and fell like the rhythm of the Nile's breath. Hours passed. When the doors opened once more, the child walked out slowly, her steps uncertain but her gaze clear. She looked at her father, touched his cheek, and said only, "I was not alone." What passed between father and daughter then was a silence that spoke louder than any scroll, and still the temple blossomed. The rites were now more than visions. They were healing, reunion, rediscovery. People who had lost the thread of their own lives came to find it once more within the scented chambers. They would drink the mixtures, hear the music, lie upon the cool stone, and afterward speak of strange lands, of voices without mouths, of memories they never lived but somehow knew. Yet in distant Thebes, the voices of dissent grew more restless. Among the tall columns of Karnak, priests of Amun began to ask troubling questions. Were the rituals at Hathor's temple not merely dreams, but dangerous delusions? What if those who claimed to see beyond the veil were not guided, but deceived? One particularly stern priest named Paheri took these concerns before the High Council. A large man with a gaze like polished obsidian, Paheri had once served in temples that offered strict order. No flowers on the altar, no flutes in the chambers. He believed in silence, obedience, and an invisible God who demanded awe rather than joy. "Something unnatural stirs in Dendera," he declared before the council, his voice echoing through the stone hall. "The people go not to worship, but to flee their own thoughts. The temple of Hathor has become a gateway for madness, for spirits to enter, for doctrine to rot." Some nodded, others murmured doubts. But Paheri's influence was strong. He proposed a formal visitation, not an accusation, but a clarification of practice. A delegation of senior priests would travel to the temple, observe the rituals, and judge for themselves whether Hathor's house had strayed from the divine path. Back in the quiet bend of the river, unaware of the storm approaching, Hekanak gazed into the water one evening and noticed something strange. The reflection of the moon rippled gently as always, but beside it floated another light, softer, golden, hovering just above the surface. It flickered, pulsed once, and was gone. He said nothing to Azara, nor to the others. But in his heart, he felt a shift, as if the air itself had leaned in to listen. The garden was opening, and not only those who sought healing would step inside. Night fell with the gentleness of a closing eye, and the winds along the Nile stirred the reeds with their soft, familiar whispers. Within the temple grounds, lanterns glowed in clusters, lighting narrow walkways of stone and sand. The scent of sweet resin drifted lazily through the air, and the low hum of a flute guided the dusk into evening. It was a quiet hour, the hour of stillness, when no prayers were spoken aloud, but everything within the temple seemed to pray on its own. Hekanak sat in the garden beside a basin of water. His reflection shimmered in its surface, barely held together by ripples. Izara had gone to gather more lotus, and the novices were in the library chambers, copying symbols by flickering torchlight. Hekanak breathed deeply, letting the air of the garden fill his lungs, air perfumed not just with plants but with presence. Here, the air always seemed alive, as though listening. He felt the pulse of the temple in his chest, not his heart's rhythm, but something older. It was a beat that had no source and no end. He sometimes imagined it came from deep beneath the earth, a kind of music embedded in the stone. But tonight, his peace was touched by a thread of tension. Word had reached them, carried on a merchant's lips. Thebes was stirring. The delegation was real. Paheri's name had arrived like a storm cloud, trailing a dry wind behind it. Sayarit, older now and walking more slowly than before, had received the news with a quiet nod. "They will come, but they will not see," she had said. Still, preparations were made. Rooms were swept more carefully. The prayer bowls were polished until they gleamed like the river at midday. The more potent blends were moved to the back shelves, hidden not from shame, but from misunderstanding. For the rites of Hathor were never meant to be watched, only entered. 3 days later, the delegation arrived. They came by bark, their sails full, their robes stiff and formal. A dozen priests and scribes disembarked in silence, led by Paheri. his presence like a stone in clear water. He stepped onto the temple grounds with slow, deliberate grace, his gaze sweeping across the garden, the shrine, the people. He did not speak. He simply observed. Hekanak met him with a respectful bow, neither submissive nor proud. "Welcome," he said. Paheri did not return the bow. "We come not as guests," he said evenly. "We come to understand what has been spoken of, whispered of, feared." And so the watching began. For 3 days and 3 nights, the delegation did nothing but watch. They observed the songs in the early morning, the offerings at midday, the quiet rituals at dusk. They took notes in narrow scrolls. They stood in the garden for hours, unmoving, as if expecting some invisible curtain to lift. They saw the temple's peace, but not its depth. They watched Isara as she guided an elder woman through the breathing rites, helping her release the memories of a lost son. They watched a young man emerge from the trance chamber, his face streaked with quiet tears, holding a drawing of symbols he swore he had never learned. They saw it all, but from the outside. On the 4th evening, Paheri requested to speak with Hekanak in private. They sat within the small cedar-lined library, where scrolls were stored like pressed flowers. A low oil lamp flickered between them, casting soft light on the walls. "You are gentle," Paheri said, "and sincere. But sincerity does not guard against error." Hekanak listened, his hands folded. "And what is the error?" Paheri leaned forward slightly. "You offer visions, emotions, things that cannot be measured. People leave your rituals changed. Yes, but by what? By whom? Is it truly Hathor who speaks to them, or something else?" Hekanak answered slowly, as if selecting his words from water. "We do not claim to speak for the gods, only to listen more carefully. What the people see is not taught to them. It comes from within, and if it brings healing, why question the door it came through?" Paheri's face remained hard, because not all doors lead home. The silence between them stretched like a bridge over a great unseen river. "You fear what is not controlled," Hekanak said at last. "But the spirit cannot be measured in cubits and reeds. It flows where it is called." Paheri stood. "And what will you do when it flows where it is not wanted?" No answer was given, nor was one demanded. That night, Paheri wandered the temple alone. The others of his delegation had retired, but he remained, his sandals soft against the stone. He passed through the outer courtyards, the shrine of offerings, the garden path, and eventually he came to the ritual chamber. The door was open, though no one stood guard. Within, incense still lingered from an earlier rite, thick, sweet, and strangely inviting. He stepped inside. There, on the central stone slab, rested a shallow bowl of dark blue liquid. A faint glow shimmered upon its surface, though no flame touched it. The air around it hummed faintly, almost imperceptibly, like the last note of a harp hanging in the silence. Paheri approached. He had not intended to. His mind, sharp as flint, resisted. But something soft and wordless, tugged at him. He reached out, touched the edge of the bowl, and brought his fingers to his lips. The effect was not immediate. There was no tremor, no collapse, no cries, only a soft sigh. And then the flickering lamp dimmed, though no wind passed. The shadows in the corners grew long, and the air pressed gently against the chamber walls. Paheri stood very still. He saw before him a hallway, not of stone, but of stars. And in the distance, someone was walking toward him, or perhaps it was he who was being drawn forward. The chamber held its breath. The night deepened, and Hekanak, sleeping in his garden room, awoke with a sudden start, the kind that comes when someone far away speaks your name in a dream. The early light of dawn crept slowly over the temple walls, softening the stone with hues of rose and gold. Birds stirred in the trees, their calls tentative, as if hesitant to disturb the delicate silence that blanketed the sacred grounds. In the sanctuary garden, dew clung to the petals of sleeping blossoms, and the wind moved only gently, respectful of what had passed in the night. Hekanak sat upright on his low mat, his breathing shallow, his gaze fixed on the pale horizon. He had dreamt not of stars or voices or the floating fields beyond, but of footsteps echoing in a corridor with no end. And within that corridor, a presence, not hostile, not kind, but lost. He rose without speaking and wrapped himself in a simple linen robe. His feet carried him unthinking through the morning mist, past the silent fountains and stone jars of fragrant oil, toward the inner ritual chamber. The doors, carved with lotus and cattle, were closed but not sealed. As he laid his palm upon the wood, a faint warmth pulsed through it. Inside, the chamber was dim. The central altar remained untouched, though the air still shimmered faintly with the residue of something stirred. There was no incense burning now, but the scent of blue lotus clung to the corners like a memory. At first glance, the room appeared as it had always been, ordered, tranquil, and yet something had changed. There, in the farthest niche of the chamber, slumped in the shadows, was Paheri. His robes were slightly disheveled, his headdress tilted. His eyes, usually so sharp, now gazed at nothing, or perhaps at something far beyond. Hekanacht approached slowly, kneeling beside him with silent care. Paheri's lips moved, but no sound came. Hekanacht leaned closer. "I saw a child," Paheri whispered, barely audible. "She walked on water, her eyes like mirrors. She told me I was made of sand, and then I wept, but I did not know why." Hekanacht placed a hand on the older priest's shoulder, steady and warm. There was no judgment in his touch, only acknowledgement. Paheri did not speak again. He allowed himself to be led gently from the chamber, through corridors now glowing with the soft gold of morning. As they passed a courtyard, a breeze lifted, stirring the hem of Hekanacht's robe and brushing gently across Paheri's face. The others, the delegation priests, the temple's novices, even Sari, gathered slowly, drawn by the sight of the two figures. None spoke until Paheri stopped at the steps of the outer garden and turned to face them. His expression was unreadable. "The practices of this temple," he said slowly, "are not what I expected. They are neither heresy nor miracle. They are a mirror." A silence followed his words, heavy with meaning. Paheri turned once more to Hekanacht. "I do not understand what I saw. I may never understand it, but I believe it was not madness." Hekanacht inclined his head, accepting the words without triumph. With that, Paheri gave a single nod to his delegation and walked toward the awaiting bark. He did not look back. In the days that followed, the temple exhaled a long, slow breath. The delegation departed quietly. Their scrolls, once filled with skeptical lines and cautious notations, now bore passages left unfinished, margins filled with symbols drawn from visions none could explain. They did not speak openly of what they had witnessed. Thays would receive a report, but it would be ambiguous, carefully worded, and strangely void of condemnation. Within the temple of Hathor, life resumed its rhythm. But something had shifted, not just within its walls, but within Hekanacht himself. Paheri's experience had stirred a new thread of thought in him, the realization that the rites they practiced did not only open doorways for the willing. Even those who resisted were not immune. The soul, he now understood, could be called forward even when the mind held tight to its gates. He spent more time in silence after that. He wandered the reed beds at the river's edge, letting his fingers skim the water's skin. He spoke less in instruction and more in questions. He invited not only the seekers, but also the skeptics, to sit with him beneath the shade of the date palms and simply breathe. One evening, as twilight began its slow descent and the sky wore the colors of bruised plum and dusty rose, Izara approached him with a scroll in hand. "It arrived from the western desert," she said softly, "from a scribe who claims to have seen visions like ours, though he has never tasted lotus nor entered trance." Hekanacht opened the scroll with care. Inside were symbols that danced in curving lines unlike any formal script. They resembled the patterns he himself had once drawn after his deepest rituals, shapes that could not be spoken, only felt. "He says they come to him in dreams," Izara continued. "He thought he was alone." Hekanacht smiled gently. He was never alone. That night, beneath the open sky, a circle was formed in the garden. No incense was burned, no drops poured, only breath, shared and slow, only presence. The stars watched in silence, and somewhere far beyond the temple's reach, a new seed of remembrance stirred beneath the sand, waiting for the right wind to uncover it. The moon had grown full again, and its light spread across the river like spilled milk. The temple of Hathor rested in a gentle hush, the kind that only arrives when something sacred is settling into the soil. The reeds at the water's edge swayed in a quiet rhythm, and the stones along the garden path held the day's warmth, releasing it slowly as if reluctant to let go. Hekanacht walked the perimeter of the temple in silence, his sandals leaving faint impressions in the dust. Each night he made this walk, not as a task, but as a conversation. He would listen to the sounds, the shifting of the leaves, the small cries of night birds, the faint lapping of water. And in between those sounds, he listened for something deeper, the voice beneath the world. Tonight, that voice was still. He paused beside a fig tree, its fruit swollen and near bursting. A moth circled lazily around a nearby lantern, and Hekanacht, ever attuned to patterns, watched its path. It did not flutter in panic as moths often did. Instead, it moved with deliberation, as though it had a destination known only to it. Azara appeared quietly at his side, her presence so light it seemed she might vanish at any moment. She carried a clay dish covered with linen. "For you," she said, handing it to him. "Dates soaked in lotus wine. You haven't eaten since midday." He accepted with a grateful nod, sitting beneath the fig tree and motioning for her to join him. They sat for a time in companionable silence, the kind shared by those who have gone together into unseen places and returned. "You felt it too," Izara said after a while. "The stillness." Hekanacht chewed thoughtfully. "Yes, it's not emptiness. It's a pause. Like the breath before speech," she said. He smiled. "Or the stillness before a vision." Since the departure of Pahari's delegation, the temple had entered a quiet phase. Fewer pilgrims arrived. The fevered curiosity that once swept through the region had settled. Yet those who came now came not for spectacle, but with quieter hearts. Travelers who had heard the story, not through rumor, but through whispers passed between family, between dreams, between the unspoken language of those who had touched something beyond. Among them was a man named Nenet. He came not on foot nor by caravan, but by a raft of reeds, his journey slow and solitary. He was older than Hekanacht, his hair white and gathered in a braid down his back, his skin deeply weathered. He carried with him a small satchel, a carved flute, and a folded cloth embroidered with symbols no one recognized. He did not ask to see the altar. He did not ask for the drought or the visions. Instead, he asked for time in the garden. For 3 days and nights, Nenet did nothing but sit beneath a sycamore, playing a flute so softly that the wind itself seemed to harmonize with it. He did not eat in the common hall, but took meals by the riverbank, alone. When he finally came to Hekanacht, it was not with questions, but with a story. "I was once a keeper of tombs," he began, his voice like dry grass. "A servant of silence. I listened to the chambers of the dead, and they spoke to me, not in words, but in moods. I kept scrolls that had not been read in generations. I lit lamps that flickered with names long erased." Hekanacht watched him with stillness, as one listens to a remembered song. "One night beneath the temple of Maat, I touched a wall I had touched 100 times before. But that night it felt awake. I pressed my palm to it, and I felt breath, not mine. And in that breath was sorrow." He paused, his eyes turning toward the pool of water that reflected the moon. "Since then, I've heard music in places where there should be none. I see colors where none are painted. And I dream of a city that has no streets, only doors." He opened his satchel and removed a bundle wrapped in linen. Inside was a small tablet, carved not with words but with a spiraling pattern, a labyrinth with no beginning or end. "It came to me in a dream," Nenet whispered, "and when I awoke, it was beside me." Hekanacht reached out, not to touch the tablet, but to honor it. He bowed his head and closed his eyes. "The doors are opening in many places," he said. "Yes," Nenet replied, "and not all of them are meant to be opened." That night, a circle of the temple's caretakers gathered beneath the great acacia tree. Nenet was invited to play, and his flute wove a song so ancient it seemed to predate the stars above. No trance was called for, no draughts were consumed. But all who sat within that circle emerged later as though they had crossed a river unseen. In the days that followed, Hekanacht began to sense something pressing at the edge of the temple's calm. Not a threat, but a pressure, like wind behind a closed curtain or water against a sealed jar. The garden's birds, once musical at dawn, now fell silent for long stretches. The stone beneath the altar chamber felt warmer than usual, as if the earth were stirring. And more dreams came, not only to Hekanacht and Isara, but to the novices, the cooks, the older priests who rarely spoke. They dreamt of voices echoing in caverns, of eyes watching through the stars, of laughter, not cruel, not joyous, but infinite. Hekanacht recorded these dreams as best he could, drawing their shapes and moods more than their content. He understood that they were not meant to be interpreted. but remembered, the way one remembers the scent of a loved one or the sound of rain from childhood. He knew something was approaching, not a moment nor a visitor, a turning. The Temple of Hathor, once a sanctuary for quiet exploration, now stood at the edge of something far older than even its foundations. And the next time the moon would rise full, it would rise over more than just a temple. It would rise over a threshold. The temple's nights grew longer, or so it seemed. The moon lingered in the sky with an unusual patience, casting its pale light across the courtyards and corridors as though watching, waiting. Even the wind took on a different sound, less a rustle and more a hush, as if nature itself had turned inward. Hekanacht had begun waking before the birds, roused not by sound but by sensation, a weight upon his chest, not painful, but insistent. Each time he opened his eyes, the ceiling above his bed appeared slightly changed, as though the carvings had rearranged themselves during sleep. He would trace them with his fingers in the dim light, whispering their patterns under his breath. One morning, Azara brought news before the sun had crested the palms. "There's a child at the gate," she said softly, "alone." Hekanacht rose without speaking. He wrapped himself in his outer robe and walked barefoot across the cool stones of the temple path. The gate was open, a rare sight, and just beyond it stood a girl no older than 9, her eyes shadowed by sleeplessness, her feet dusty from the road. She did not seem frightened. She did not even ask to enter. She simply looked at Hekanacht and said, "I heard music. I followed it." He nodded slowly and extended a hand. She took it without hesitation. They did not question who had sent her or from where. In the days that followed, she remained in the garden, speaking little, observing much. The other children of the temple, few though they were, seemed to instinctively avoid her, not from fear, but reverence. She was given a simple room, food, and linen robes, and in return she gave her presents. At night, she sang, softly, without language, a song like breath and memory braided together. Those who heard it felt both comforted and undone. Nenet, still within the temple, listened to her one evening from behind a stone column. "She knows something," he murmured to Hekanacht later. "Something older than speech." Izara watched the girl too. "She has no name," she said. "Or she does, but it's one we've forgotten how to pronounce." No rituals were performed with the child. She was not given the draughts, nor shown the inner sanctum. Yet she walked the grounds as though she knew them already. Sometimes she would pause beside a wall and lay her ear against it, whispering into the stone as if greeting an old friend. And strange things began to happen. The garden bloomed out of season. Pale blossoms unfolded at night, gleaming in the dark. The small pond behind the temple cleared, and beneath its surface, perfect spirals of silt formed and reformed in slow motion. Birds returned, species unseen in the region for decades. They sang at dusk, in trios and pairs, as if summoned. One evening, the girl approached Hekanacht where he sat with Izara beneath the acacia tree. "It's waking up," she said. "What is?" Izara asked gently. The girl pointed toward the ground beneath them. "The temple," she said. "It was asleep, but now it remembers." That night, Hekanacht dreamt of doors. Not the ornate doors of temples, but simple ones, wooden, stone, woven from reeds. They stood in fields, in mountains, beneath the sea. Some were ajar, others sealed. One in particular drew him near. It was made of black basalt, smooth and seamless, with no handle. He touched it, and heard weeping on the other side. When he awoke, the girl stood at the foot of his bed. "It called you," she said. He sat up slowly, the edges of sleep still clinging to his breath. "What does it want?" "To be remembered," she whispered. Hekanacht met with Sarit that morning, the first time in many days. She had grown quieter in her age, but her eyes remained bright and watchful. "I've seen this before," she said when he told her of the girl. "Once, long ago, when I was very young, a child came then too. She knew the names of all the stones in the courtyard, though no one had taught her. She stayed for one moon, then vanished." "Was she the same?" "I don't know," Sarit replied, "but the feeling was." Hekanacht studied her face. "What happened after she left?" "The temple changed, the dreams deepened, and then a door opened beneath the altar." He felt his breath catch. "A real door?" Sarit nodded. "No one built it. It was simply there one morning, beneath the stone basin. We entered it only once." "What did you find?" "Nothing," she said, "but we never returned. The door sealed itself. We let it sleep." That evening, Hekanak stood alone in the sanctuary. The altar's surface gleamed softly under the oil lamps, and the scent of myrrh hung low in the air. He approached slowly, tracing the familiar carvings with his fingertips. Then, without fully knowing why, he stepped behind the altar and knelt. The floor was warm. He placed his hand flat against it and felt it rise as if breathing. He looked up. The girl stood in the doorway, her eyes reflecting the light like still water. "It's time," she said. "You should go back." Hekanak did not ask where or what. He simply nodded. Because some truths do not arrive in words. They arrive in echoes, in footsteps, in silence that gathers just before revelation. And the silence had come. The air beneath the altar grew heavy that night, not with dread, but with the strange softness of a long-awaited memory. Hekanak stood before the stone slab, and though nothing visible had changed, he sensed the threshold shifting beneath him. The temple was no longer merely a place, it was an instrument, and the melody it had begun to play came from deeper than walls or chants. It came from the space between memory and myth. He called for Asara. She arrived swiftly, lantern in hand, her breath still fogged from the cool of night. The girl followed not far behind, her bare feet silent on the stone. She carried nothing but her gaze, which did not waver, not even in the dimness of the inner chamber. "I believe," Hekanak said quietly. "The Dorsarit spoke of is waking again." Azara placed her lantern on a ledge and knelt beside the altar. She ran her hands over the floor, then paused. "There," she whispered. At the base of the rear wall, a seam had begun to appear, faint, like a scar on ancient skin. It hadn't been there before. No carving marked it, and yet it was undeniably a frame. A door, not crafted, but grown. They did not try to open it that night. They only watched it, the three of them, as if watching a seed stir beneath soil. And in that silence they felt not fear, but invitation. The next morning, Hekanak gathered the elders of the temple. They met in the shade of the Tamaris grove, seated in a loose circle. Some of them were old enough to remember Sarit's story of the sealed chamber. Others had only ever known the temple as it was now, a haven for seekers, a vessel for visions. Hekanak told them everything. Not all were at ease. "It was sealed for a reason," said Anu, a priestess who had served the temple since girlhood. "What lies beneath may not want to be touched." "Or it may have waited for this moment," Ninette said softly. "Not all sleep is escape. Sometimes sleep is waiting." A silence settled among them. The birds in the grove stilled, and a breeze passed through the leaves like a sigh. In the end, no vote was taken. No command was given. The temple, as always, moved not by decree, but by readiness. At dusk, they gathered in the sanctuary. There was no audience, no ritual procession, only those who had heard the calling. Hekanak, Asara, Ninette the girl, and two others who had long served in silence and whose names were rarely spoken aloud, even within the temple. They stood before the stone once more. Isara placed her hand upon the seam. It felt cool at first, then warmer. The stone shifted beneath her fingers, not with force, but like the unfurling of a flower. With a faint sound like a breath released after years, the door opened. Behind it lay darkness. Not the darkness of absence, but the thick, velvet dark of a sealed memory. A stairway curved downward, cut into the living stone, its steps worn smooth by age unknown. There were no torches, yet a faint glow pulsed from within, dim but steady, like moonlight filtered through water. They descended together, the girl leading. The air grew cooler as they moved down, but not unpleasantly so. It smelled of old earth, of myrrh long buried, of something floral and bitter all at once. As they reached the bottom, the passage opened into a vast chamber, oval, silent, humming. And there in the center stood a single stone basin. It was shallow, wide, filled not with liquid but with dust, fine, shimmering silver blue. It moved without breeze, swirling in slow spirals that defied logic. The basin itself was carved with symbols no one recognized. They were not hieroglyphs. They were older. Hekanak stepped forward, drawn without intention. The dust within the basin pulsed faintly as he approached. He did not touch it. The girl looked up at him. "This is where they listened," she said. "Who?" Izara asked. "The first ones," the girl replied. "Before temples, before names. They built nothing. They left only songs." Hekanak felt a deep ache in his chest, not of pain, but of remembrance, a longing for something he could not name. "I have heard this music," Ninette whispered, tears forming in his old eyes. "In my sleep, since I was a boy." Hekanak knelt slowly and placed both hands on the rim of the basin. The dust responded, rising gently, dancing in soft arcs around his fingers. It made no sound, yet all who stood in the chamber began to hear something. A tone, deep and clear, not heard by ears but felt in the spine. Then the room shifted, not in space, but in sensation. They were no longer in a chamber beneath stone. They were inside a memory, not their own, but the temple's, or perhaps the earth's. Visions shimmered in the air, not images, but impressions. A vast river with no shores, beings of light walking across it, a tree that bore no fruit, only light, and a circle of humans sitting in silence, hands joined, listening to the breath of the world. Then, silence again. The glow faded. Hekanak stepped back, his breath shallow. No one spoke. They returned up the stairway without a word. The door closed behind them, not with finality, but with calm. It did not seal shut. It merely rested. Back in the sanctuary, the lamps flickered gently. Hekanak looked at the girl. Will it open again? She smiled, a smile both ancient and childlike. When you're ready to remember more. And then she walked into the garden, her figure blending with the shadows as if she had always belonged to them. The days that followed were hushed. The temple did not speak of the chamber, nor did it avoid it. It simply allowed its presence to settle, as one does when a forgotten part of the body begins to feel again. The sanctuary remained open. The rituals resumed. The incense burned as it always had, and yet the air held a different weight. Not heavier, but deeper, as if the wind itself now moved with memory. Hekanak found himself dreaming with more clarity than ever before. He no longer floated through fields or gardens as he once had. Now his visions carried him into rooms carved from sound, where voices shaped the walls and songs became stairways. He saw towers made of woven light and heard languages without consonants, soft pulses of thought that arrived as understanding rather than speech. Each morning he rose in stillness, unsure whether he had dreamed or remembered. Izara too had changed. Her movements slowed, not with fatigue, but with intention. She had taken to spending long hours with the novices, teaching not just the breathing techniques or sacred chants, but the act of listening, not to her, but to the space between their own thoughts. She no longer spoke of visions. She simply watched. The child, whose name remained unspoken, wandered now less like a guest and more like a guardian. She rarely entered the sanctuary again, choosing instead to sit beneath the sycamore tree for hours on end, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes closed. Birds gathered around her. Animals followed her and then lay near without fear. Even the bees no longer avoided her presence, hovering instead in lazy orbits around her fingers. One night, under a moon half veiled by cloud, a new visitor arrived. He came wrapped in linen stained with desert dust, his feet bare, his hair uncut. He carried no offerings, no scrolls, no titles. But his eyes were sharp, not with judgment, but with a hunger for stillness. He called himself Alcera, a name worn like a shadow. Hekanak met him at the gate. I have walked for 9 days without speaking, Alcera said. The silence grew so loud I could no longer hear my own thoughts. Then I dreamt of a temple that was not built but grown, and I followed the dream here. Hekanak studied him for a long moment. Then you have not come to seek. You have come to remember. Alcera nodded. If you will have me, I will sit at the edges until the center calls. He was given a quiet space near the tamarisk grove where the wind seldom stirred. He spoke to no one for 2 full days, taking only water and a few figs. Then, without ceremony, he rose and joined the garden circles at dusk, adding nothing, asking nothing, simply breathing with those around him. He was not the only one drawn to the temple now without guidance. Over the following weeks, more came, not pilgrims in search of healing, nor scholars in search of knowledge, but people who felt something stirring in them they could no longer explain away. A woman who had stopped painting after the death of her daughter, now painting again in colors she said came to her in dreams. A former soldier who could no longer sleep without seeing fields of fire, now sleeping beneath the temple palms with tears on his face. A child who spoke in riddles until she heard the girl's song, and then sat in perfect silence for hours listening. None were turned away, but neither were they led. For the temple of Hathor had changed. It no longer taught, it reminded. One morning, as the mist still clung to the stone and the light broke like water over the horizon, Nenet came to Hekanacht with a bundle wrapped in blue cloth. I awoke with this in my hands, he said, laying it gently down. I do not know what it is. Hekanacht unwrapped the bundle carefully. Inside was a length of papyrus, blank but for a single symbol in its center, a spiral inside a square, inside a ring. None in the temple had seen this symbol before, yet they all knew it. It is the map, Izara said, her voice barely above a whisper, but not of a place, of a turning. That evening, the child appeared once more in the sanctuary. She stood before the altar and placed her hands upon the stone. The door did not open, but the room changed. The walls shimmered slightly, their surface no longer rigid but fluid. The carving seemed to shift, not physically, but perceptually. Shapes emerged from them, not just birds and eyes and ankhs, but spirals, waves, keys, and orbs. And from the ceiling came a low, resonant hum, as if the air itself had begun to sing. The child turned to Hekanacht. Some truths are not taught, she said. They are remembered by standing in the place where they were first forgotten. Hekanacht stepped forward. What are we remembering? The girl's eyes were ancient and soft. That you are not only flesh, not only mind, but doorway. And with that, the hum deepened, and for the first time, the altar itself began to glow, not with fire, but with breath. And those gathered knew, not through logic or proof, but through a feeling deep in their bones, that the next time they entered the chamber below, it would not show them the past. It would show them what had always waited beneath their forgetting. The nights had grown quiet, not from stillness but from anticipation. The temple no longer moved in the old rhythms alone. Beneath its daily rituals, the grinding of herbs, the chants at twilight, the soft cleaning of the inner sanctum, there pulsed a second rhythm, slow and strong, like the echo of a drumbeat coming from deep below the earth. The door beneath the altar had not opened again, and yet its presence was constant, like a second heart beating within the temple's chest. Hekanacht began to notice the change in time itself. Hours stretched or shrank without warning. Dreams lingered long into waking. Conversations began to flow without speech. A glance, a breath, a shared silence, becoming more eloquent than words. The boundary between night and day, sleep and waking, seemed to blur. One morning, Isara entered his chamber without knocking, her expression unreadable. The child is gone. He rose at once, following her through the corridors and into the garden, past the fig trees and flowering shrubs, all the way to the tamarisk grove. The mat where the girl had often sat was empty. Her footprints still marked the dust around it, but they ended at the edge of the grove. No trail led away. Nothing was disturbed. No one had seen her leave. No one had heard her go. Alzer, seated cross-legged near the water basin, looked up as they passed. She hasn't left, he said. Hekanacht turned. You saw her? No, but I feel her. She's still here, just further inward. That day the temple fell into an uncanny hush. Even the birds held their songs. People walked more slowly, as if moving through water. Novices paused mid-sentence, distracted by thoughts they couldn't name. It was not fear. It was listening. Hekanacht returned to the sanctuary alone before dusk. He approached the altar, laying both hands upon the stone. It was warm, not with sunlight, but with presence. And he knew, without question, that the door below was calling once more. But not just him. That evening, he summoned those who had gathered in recent weeks. Not only the elders, but the quiet ones, the weavers, the gardeners, the listeners. Alsera, Nenet, Asara, the woman who painted, the soldier who now wept in sleep, even the mute child who had come without name. They gathered at moonrise in the sanctuary, seated in a circle around the altar. No chants, no instructions, only breath. And the breath deepened. The door opened without touch or word, stone folding inward like a sigh. Together they descended. The chamber below had changed. The dust in the basin no longer swirled. It hovered, suspended, glowing faintly, as though awaiting touch. The air held a tone, not a sound, but a pressure behind the ears like the moments before thunder. And upon the walls, the once faint symbols had deepened into clarity, arranged now in rings like ripples expanding from a single drop. They approached the basin one by one, and each time a hand was extended, the dust responded, not lifting but unfolding as if offering something. Izara was the first to see. As her fingers passed through the dust, her eyes widened and tears welled immediately. She sank to her knees, but not in sorrow. Her breath came shallow, fast, then slowed to stillness. When she spoke, it was barely more than air. I saw. The first breath I ever took, she whispered. Not in this life, but the first. When the wind moved through the body that would become mine. Ninette was next. The dust formed a spiral around his hand, then rose to touch his forehead. He wept openly. It was not a memory. It was a remembering of being remembered. Each who approached received a vision, not of gods, nor heavens, nor sacred judgment, but of moments so deeply personal, so entirely beyond words, that they could only be held in silence. Visions of forgotten joy, of being part of something whole, of being seen. When Hekanak stepped forward, the basin stilled, and then it darkened. The dust fell, and in its place light formed, not bright, but soft and endless, stretching in all directions. He stepped into it, and the chamber vanished. He stood in a place without floor or sky. Around him drifted shapes, not forms, but feelings, clusters of memory, or thought, or something older. He felt them as much as saw them, and one of them moved closer. It was not a being, not a voice, but an awareness. It carried no name, no shape, and yet it felt familiar, as though it had once cradled him in silence before he had ever known the sound of his own name. You have remembered enough to ask, it said, though not aloud. What is this place? Hekanak thought. It is the breath between lifetimes. He did not understand the words, but he felt them, and in feeling, he knew. Why now? He asked. Because the forgetting has ripened, and when forgetting ripens, remembering must bloom. He asked one last question, not with words, but with yearning. What are we? The awareness moved closer. You are not the flame, you are the space it illuminates. And then the vision receded. He stood once more before the basin. Around him, the others sat or knelt, each in their own stillness. No one spoke. There was no need. As they ascended back into the sanctuary, dawn began to bloom across the horizon. The wind returned. The birds sang again. And the temple, though unchanged in stone, now breathed like a body newly born. Morning rose over the temple like a veil being drawn aside, delicate and slow, revealing a world no longer the same. Yet to any stranger arriving from the river, nothing would have seemed unusual. The reeds still swayed in rhythm with the current. The outer walls still bore their ancient carvings, worn by centuries of sun. The courtyard still echoed softly with the footsteps of priests, the flapping of heron wings, and the murmur of prayer. But within the temple, something had shifted forever. Those who had descended into the chamber beneath the altar now carried silence differently. It sat with them, not as absence, but as depth, a silence so full it hummed. They no longer rushed their task, nor spoke needlessly. Even the laughter, when it came, was gentler, softer, as if everyone now knew that every sound, every breath was being heard by something vast and tender. Izara, who had once guided initiates through the rites of blue lotus and breath, now spent her hours tending the fig trees with her hands in the soil. Her eyes, which once searched the horizon, now lingered on small details, the curve of a petal, the way ants formed lines like script along the garden wall. She spoke less, but when she did, her words carried the calm certainty of someone who had seen the root of the mountain. Ninette, though old, seemed younger. He no longer woke in the night with anxious thoughts or ancient regrets. Instead, he took to singing again, not the structured hymns of temple rites, but low, meandering songs that had no beginning or end, songs that sounded like rivers. Azer had taken up carving. Without being asked, he began shaping pieces of driftwood into spiral forms and circles, some smooth as stone, others left rough and textured. He left them throughout the temple, beside the wells, near doorways, on windowsills. When asked why, he only smiled and said, "So the wind has something to remember." And Hekanak, he began to dream wide. He did not sleep more than before, but his dreams reached further. They no longer carried him only through chambers of the mind, but into moments that did not seem his own, though they beat in his chest like memories. He saw a woman standing beneath a tree of light, her face covered in markings made from sound. He saw a boy carving symbols into wet clay, guided by a star that pulsed in rhythm with his breath. He saw people without name or time, listening together, their bodies arranged in vast circles across the desert, forming patterns only visible from far above. Each dream brought with it no answers, but a kind of opening, a loosening of the tight knots that had once made the world seem fixed. One afternoon, as the sun hung high, and the air was heavy with the scent of warmed herbs. A traveler arrived. She wore no sandals, no jewelry. Her hair was braided into a crown of leaves, and her eyes were ringed with red pigment. She carried a satchel of dried flowers and a long walking staff wrapped with strands of bark and cloth. She did not ask to speak with anyone. She simply sat by the river. For 3 days she remained there, unmoving, eyes closed, hands resting upon her knees. At night, she did not return to the temple. She slept beneath the stars, uncovered, her body curled beside the papyrus reeds. On the 4th morning, she rose and entered the garden. Hikanak, kneeling beside a basin of rainwater, looked up as she approached. He did not speak, but he bowed his head as one would to an equal. She returned the bow. "I am one of the remembered," she said. Hikanak nodded, though the title was new. "We have watched from far places, mountains, islands, forests where no temples rise. We felt the pulse in the stone. The chamber has begun to sing again, and so I came." "Are there many of you?" he asked. "Not many, but enough." She sat beside him, and together they washed the stems of dried herbs in silence. She moved as though time passed through her differently. She knew the names of each plant not in language, but in touch. She said that memory, when unbound, lives in the hands. That evening, she was invited to the inner sanctuary. The door beneath the altar opened once again, not by ritual, not by force, but by presence. She stepped into the chamber and placed her palm upon the basin without hesitation, and the dust within rose, not as a spiral, not as a circle, but as a tree. Its branches stretched toward the ceiling, flickering with light, and from its invisible roots came a sound like deep, slow thunder. She closed her eyes. When she spoke, her voice was not loud, but it filled the room. "It is time," she said. "The temple remembers its origin, but now it must remember its reason." "What is its reason?" Izara asked softly. "To listen," the woman replied, "to become a place where the world speaks to itself." She turned to Hekanak, and for that the remembering must spread. Hekanak felt something in him resist, a flicker of fear. To keep the temple safe had been his devotion. To open it to the world felt like placing a flame into the wind. But the woman's gaze held his. "You do not guard a treasure," she said. "You are a lantern. Light must touch more than the wick." And then she bowed. The next morning she was gone. No one saw her leave. No trail was found. Only a single carving left near the garden gate, a spiral inside a ring, inside a leaf. That day, for the first time in many generations, a scroll was sent down the river, carried by hand, not courier, its words not formal, but alive. An invitation, not to visit, but to remember. And so the wind shifted, not as warning, but as welcome. The scroll traveled slowly down the Nile, borne not by decree or temple command, but by the current itself, placed within a vessel of woven reeds, its seal marked not with any royal insignia, but with the spiral, the ring, and the leaf. Carried past fishermen who paused in reverence without knowing why, past reed beds where ibis stirred and crocodiles basked without menace, it drifted toward places that had forgotten how to listen. And as it moved, something else moved with it, an unseen hum, a soft pulling of breath through unseen spaces. The river knew, the trees along its banks knew, and those attuned to dreams felt it first, a waking not loud but deep. Back at the temple, days folded into one another like linen set out in the sun. There was no longer a distinction between the old order and what had begun. The rites of Hathor, music, breath, presence, ecstasy, had not vanished, but they had softened into something more spacious. The people no longer gathered to invoke, they gathered to remember. The boundary between seeker and keeper had dissolved. Even the novices, once trained in structured silence and controlled movement, now moved like dancers between rituals and rest. They sang not from scrolls, but from the heart. They listened more than they spoke. And in the gardens beneath the acacia trees, they began planting herbs long forgotten, guided by dreams and the gentle intuition of hands and soil. Hekanak spent more time in solitude now, not to withdraw, but to deepen. He would sit for hours by the water basin beneath the tamarisk, his thoughts still, his senses open. At times animals came near, a fox resting at his feet, or doves circling and then landing on the stone wall beside him. He never moved them away. He had learned that the world approached most honestly when met with stillness. One evening, as the sun began to lower itself into the river, painting everything in molten gold, Azara approached him with a question that had lingered for many days. What do we do, she asked gently, when the temple no longer holds us, when the remembering wants to go further? He looked at her long and quiet. Then we let it walk, he said, and we walk with it. She knelt beside him, and together they watched the sky change. The clouds drifted in shapes that seemed almost meaningful, one like a hand, another like an eye, then a spiral that dissolved before it could be named. That night, beneath the full moon, they gathered once more in the chamber below. The basin no longer responded only to touch. Now it responded to presence. As each person entered, the dust stirred faintly, adjusting to them, sensing them. And then it rose of its own accord, not in shapes nor symbols, but as a mist, the chamber filled with a silvery vapor that did not sting the eyes nor choke the breath. Instead, it opened something unseen. Each who breathed it felt their senses widen, as though they were standing not in a room, but in many rooms at once, each containing a version of themselves, each holding a piece of the story. In the mist, visions began, not loud, not sudden. They came as glimpses behind the veil of thought. A woman saw herself weaving cloth not for a body, but for a voice. A man remembered the way his hands had once shaped fire into tools. A child, silent all her life, began to hum softly, a note carried from a life not her own, yet fully hers. And Hekanak saw a field, vast, dry, filled with stones arranged in a great spiral. At the center stood not a statue, but a tree carved of blackwood, its roots reaching deep into the ground. People stood around it, not praying, not speaking, only listening. And as he watched, the tree began to breathe. He awoke later not in fear, but in awe. The others stirred beside him slowly, some with tears, some with smiles. No one needed to speak. They understood that something had shifted again, not in the temple, but in themselves. The chamber, too, had changed. A second door had appeared. It lay opposite the basin, low to the ground, shaped like a crescent moon. There were no handles, no seams, only the faint outline of entry, an invitation, but not yet a command. Izara was the first to speak. "It's not time to enter," she said. Hekanak nodded, "But it will be." And so they began to prepare, not through plan or instruction, but by deepening their listening. The temple slowed even further. Visitors who arrived expecting rites were instead greeted with silence and offered a place in the garden. Those who stayed long enough found that the silence was not absence, but presence. Those who left too quickly carried only the impression of still air and strange people. But those who lingered felt it, the pull of something remembering itself through them. Far away, in lands untouched by Nile water, others began to stir. A woman in the hills of the Red Land dreamt of a door carved from mist. A boy born in a mountain village woke speaking a language his mother did not know, though she wept when she heard it. The remembering had begun to walk. And the spiral, once hidden in stone and basin and breath, now moved through stories, through silence, through song. The temple no longer called. It listened and waited. The heat of midsummer settled over the Nile like a soft weight, drawing long shadows across the courtyards and slowing every movement to a languid rhythm. The temple stone, warmed by unbroken sun, released its heat into the evening air as gently as a mother breathing over a sleeping child. Time inched forward with the sound of cicadas and the faint rustle of palms, as though even the hours had chosen to rest. Within the temple, the silence deepened further, taking on a sacred quality that reached beyond meditation. Fewer rituals were held aloud now. The daily practices, once vibrant with voices and instruments, had grown still and spacious. Water was poured not as offering, but as remembrance. Herbs were burned not for scent, but for memory. Each action, though small, was layered with presence. The second door beneath the altar remained unopened, but it pulsed, not visibly, not in any physical way. But those who came near it began to feel their hearts shift, sometimes speeding, sometimes slowing, as though the rhythm of their bodies was trying to match something just beyond perception. Hekanak began spending his nights in the sanctuary, resting not in a chamber but near the altar itself. He no longer dreamt as before. Instead, he entered what felt like long conversations, though no words were ever spoken. He would close his eyes, and the darkness would not come. Only light, dim and endless. In that light, he would feel questions, not from himself, but from somewhere far and familiar. And each morning he would wake with a new knowing that could not be written down. Izara noticed it first. "You've changed," she said one morning as they walked through the upper garden. "You move like someone who's left something behind, but I don't know what." Hekanak smiled, not with pride or secrecy, but with softness. "I don't know either," he said. "Only that I feel lighter, as if I'm no longer trying to hold what was never mine." They passed a young acolyte seated beside a circle of stones, humming to herself as she arranged petals by color. The air was thick with the scent of dried hibiscus and rose. In the far corner, Alzer sat carving another spiral, but now with smaller, more delicate curves. He said the wood had begun telling him where it wanted to be touched. Later that afternoon, a storm rolled quietly over the desert horizon. It did not bring thunder, nor rain, but a strange stillness that arrived ahead of it, a deep, pressing calm, like the breath before weeping. The sky darkened not with clouds, but with a veil of golden haze. Light filtered through it strangely, casting elongated shadows and bathing the temple in a hue that felt more memory than color. Animals stilled, birds quieted, even the insects fell silent. The temple held its breath. Hekanak stood alone in the sanctuary when the second door began to glow. It did not open. It shimmered. Lines once invisible began to trace themselves across its surface, patterns not etched but revealed. Spirals again, yes, but now interwoven with other forms. Ovals like eyes, lines like waves, and at the center, a single leaf shape, the same as the one left by the woman who had called herself Remembered. He called Azara, then Alzera, then Net, and the silent child, and those who had walked the spiral path in recent moons. They gathered not with urgency, but with awareness. The chamber below was dim, the basin still, the dust resting once more like soft sand. The second door, fully visible now, radiated a low heat that could be felt without touch. Its glow was not threatening. It felt like the warmth of someone waiting on the other side. Hekanak stepped forward. No one spoke. No one needed to. He knelt before the door, placing both hands flat upon its surface. And the room changed. The walls did not shift, but something deeper did. The sense of distance vanished. They no longer felt beneath the temple, but within something much larger. A field, a body, a memory too vast for one name. The door opened, but what lay beyond it was not a corridor, nor a hidden chamber. It was a field of stars, not the sky, but stars arranged like a plane, stretching out in every direction, beneath their feet and above their heads and within their very breath. They were not walking, yet they moved. They were not speaking, yet their hearts beat in unison. Some wept, some laughed quietly, others simply closed their eyes and felt the vastness around them. And in the center of it all stood the girl, the one who had vanished. Her arms were outstretched, not in welcome, not in power, simply open. And in her presence, they remembered, not what they had done, but what they were. Each saw something different, a face, a place, a gesture, but all felt the same truth. They had been here before, not in this body, not in this form, but in this remembering. And then the stars began to pulse, not with light, but with rhythm, the same rhythm they had heard in dreams, in breath, in silence. It gathered, not toward them, but through them. And when the pulse grew still again, they were back in the chamber. No one fell. No one cried out. They simply breathed, together. And in that breath, the spiral turned once more. The spiral had turned. And though the world outside the temple remained unchanged in its daily movements, the Nile still rippling, the market traders still calling over baskets of fruit and grain, something within those who had stepped through the second door could no longer return to its former shape. Their silence had deepened, but it was no longer the silence of restraint or reverence alone. It was the silence of recognition, the kind of stillness that comes when the search has ceased, not because the seeker is finished, but because the path has become them. Hekanak walked the temple's perimeter at dawn, as he had done since youth. The dust felt different underfoot now, not lighter or heavier, but more known, as if each step pressed into a memory rather than a surface. He noticed small things, insects moving in synchronized patterns, petals opening not with the sun but in time with unseen rhythms, shadows falling where no structure cast them. He paused by the sycamore tree, where once the girl had sat for hours on end. The mat she had used still remained, woven from reeds, fraying slightly at the corners. He knelt beside it and placed his hand upon the ground. The earth was warm, as if something beneath it was still breathing. "She isn't gone," Izara said behind him. He didn't turn. "No, just returned." "To what?" she asked. "To the part of us we forget." Together they sat in silence as the morning bloomed. The scent of desert wind carried something strange with it. The sweetness of dried fruit, the dust of far-traveled paths, and a faint trace of blue lotus long since harvested. That day, two strangers arrived. They came not together, yet within hours of one another. One from the south, her robes dyed with ochre and crushed bark, her hair wrapped in a cloth embroidered with symbols of the moon. The other from the north, dressed plainly, face sun-darkened, carrying nothing but a shallow bowl of river stones. Neither asked for hospitality. Neither requested entry. They simply waited near the water's edge. When Hekanak approached, the woman bowed once and said, "I saw the tree of stars," and the man, without knowing her words, echoed softly, "And I stood beneath it." Hekanak said nothing. He only gestured toward the inner gate. They followed without question. That night, the sanctuary was opened once more, not only to them, but to all who had begun to gather, drawn by dreams, by visions, by stories passed quietly in markets and whispered in twilight under open skies. The temple did not extend invitation, but it no longer withheld entry. Its doors opened not by decree, but by resonance. And still, the second door remained. It had not vanished after their vision. It stood in quiet patience, its edges now traced with tiny carvings too intricate to have been made by hand. Spirals nested within spirals, constellations not from the heavens above, but from those seen behind closed eyes. That night, a new rite began. Not taught, not spoken. It emerged. One by one, those present took turns placing their hands upon the door, not to enter, not to awaken it, but simply to greet it. And with each touch, the chamber shifted. Slightly, subtly, the air thickened. The walls echoed faint tones. The basin long still began to shimmer again, not with light, but with potential. Alcer, who had spent weeks carving spirals in silence, now placed his latest piece at the foot of the door. A small wooden disc with a hollow center, smooth and unmarked, save for a single crack across its surface. "It came this way," he said simply. "I did not make the crack." Hekanak examined it and nodded. Not all things must be whole to be sacred. The group sat in a wide circle that evening around the basin and the door, and for the first time, no one spoke. Not even the wind moved. And then the child returned, not in body, but in voice. It came from nowhere and everywhere. A hum, low, melodic, wordless, moving through the chamber like a slow wave. It was unmistakably hers, soft, rising, falling, familiar. And with it came images, not visions, but memories unearthed. A priest remembered holding a dying stranger's hand. A woman saw herself singing to her mother in a language lost to time. A child, once silent, suddenly whispered the name of a place she had never visited, An Keset. When the hum faded, the silence was not empty, it was alive. And the door, once a boundary, now pulsed like a heartbeat. Hekanak rose, slowly, carefully. "We are no longer entering," he said. "We are becoming." That night, no dreams came, not because the dreaming had ended, but because the dreamer was now fully awake. The moon waxed fuller with each passing night, casting its light in wider circles, touching the farthest corners of the temple grounds with a silvery softness. It illuminated the worn stones of the outer walls, the blossoms that curled open only after sunset, and the quiet faces of those who now dwelled within. The temple was no longer a place set apart from the world. It had become something like a mirror, gently reflecting a deeper rhythm that pulsed beneath the surface of all things. Hekanak no longer woke with dreams. Instead, he awoke with knowing. His days were filled with small acts, guiding a child's hands through a meditation of stillness, offering dried fruit to a passing crane, tracing unseen patterns into the sand with a reed stalk. Nothing he did was extraordinary, and yet everything shimmered with meaning. One morning, just before sunrise, he stood on the roof of the highest temple chamber. The wind was soft against his skin, and the stars above were beginning to fade into the soft lavender of pre-dawn. From this height, he could see the river twisting into the distance, threading its way between palms and fields, carrying with it stories older than any scroll. He heard footsteps behind him. It was Isara, her hair still damp from washing, her robe pulled close against the early chill. "You feel it too," she said. He didn't answer. There was no need. The second door had remained untouched for several days, but none had spoken of it with worry. Its presence no longer demanded action. It waited like a garden in winter, alive but turned inward. Something's shifting again, Izara murmured. But it's not coming from the temple. It's coming from elsewhere. Hekanak nodded slowly. The remembering is spreading. Across the river, in the village of Baket, a healer had begun singing in her sleep. Her husband said the melodies carried through the night and calmed the sick without medicine. In a fishing camp north of Dendera, a boy described a tree he saw in dreams, with silver leaves and roots that hummed, and when asked where it was, he pointed directly south toward the temple. And deeper in the Red Land, where no temple stood and few dared settle, a band of desert nomads had uncovered a stone half buried in sand, carved with a single spiral encircled by flame. News arrived slowly, passed from mouth to mouth, unadorned by title or command, but it reached the temple all the same. Nenet, now slower in his steps, had taken to recording the tales. He sat for hours beneath the acacia tree with a reed pen and scraps of parchment, scribbling the accounts brought by travelers. He did not organize them. He did not analyze. He simply listened and wrote. He called them threads. Because that's what they are, he told Zere one evening. Each of them is a thread of the same cloth, and when enough have been gathered, the shape will show itself. Alzer, ever quiet, nodded and continued carving. He had begun working with stone now, shaping it not into symbols, but into openings, ovals and hollows that invited light to pass through. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the western hills and cast the sky in bands of orange and deep cobalt, the door pulsed again, not with light, but with memory. Those nearest it felt a sudden rush of scent, myrrh, honey, rain on dry earth, followed by an overwhelming wave of emotion that did not belong to any single one of them. It was collective, like the breath of 1,000 stories exhaled all at once. Hekanak arrived moments later, drawn by the change in air. The chamber was not filled, yet it felt crowded, as though others stood there too, unseen. Those who had entered the remembering before stood still, eyes half closed, hands over hearts. The child's voice came once more, but this time it carried words. The doorway is not a place. Hekanak closed his eyes, listening with his whole body. It is a moment, and the moment is near. A low tone, like the first note of a harp struck in the dark, spread through the chamber. Then silence, and then a tremor, not in the earth, in themselves, as if a thread had been pulled from the deepest part of them, not to unravel, but to lead. Afterward, no one spoke of what they felt, but all began to prepare, not in frenzy or fear, but in care. Scrolls were wrapped in cloth and placed in baskets near the sanctuary wall. Herbs were bundled, offerings were gathered. A single space was cleared beside the altar and marked with a spiral drawn in ash. No one was told what to do, yet all knew what was needed. Even the birds changed their patterns, flying in wide arcs over the temple, as though tracing a circle around it. The wind turned warmer. The reeds along the water's edge bloomed out of season, and at night, from the high roof, Hekanak could see lanterns lighting in distant homes, scattered lights across the dark landscape, each a small echo of the fire they carried within. He realized then that the remembering had never been meant for one place alone. The temple had been a beginning, but the remembering was the return. The days that followed arrived with the softness of silk, smooth, silent, and impossibly light. A hush settled over the temple grounds, not imposed, but welcomed, as though every wall, every leaf, every breath had agreed to hold its voice a little longer. Even the animals seemed to sense the nearness of something vast. Cats moved without sound. The herons by the river stood perfectly still for hours. Bees, usually busy in sunlit frenzy, now circled the blossoms in slower, wider orbits. Hekanak spent the afternoons in the garden, not meditating, not leading, simply being. People came and went beside him, some sitting for only minutes, others for hours. None spoke unless words emerged naturally, and more often than not, they didn't. Presence had become the new language. The second door beneath the altar no longer pulsed with urgency. It had settled into a quiet glow, steady, sure, like the heartbeat of something sleeping lightly. The vision of stars, the child's voice, the tremors of inner memory, all of it had softened, leaving behind not a command but a knowing. A moment was approaching. Not an event, a moment. The kind of moment that arrives like a breath between lifetimes, changing everything without force. On the seventh night after the voice last spoke, the wind shifted from the north, dry and cool, tinged with the scent of distant fig groves. In the inner garden, Izara stood barefoot beneath the moon, her palms open to the sky. Alzir carved quietly near the southern wall, now shaping a large stone spiral into the ground itself, his hands guided more by sensation than plan. Nenet had finished his collection of threads. The scrolls now lay within a woven basket by the sanctuary door, wrapped in linen dyed from crushed lotus and smoke. He touched the cloth each morning and each evening, not to check, not to count, but to honor. That same night, another traveler arrived. She came from the west, her cloak heavy with desert dust, her hair tied back with leather cord, her fingers stained with clay. She carried nothing, no offering, no message, only a small circular pendant carved from obsidian, etched with 3 lines crossing at the center. Hekanak met her at the garden gate. "You've come far," he said gently. She nodded. "I followed the echo." He offered no questions, only his hand. That night, she sat in the chamber beneath the altar for hours, her back to the glowing door, her eyes closed. The others watched, but did not disturb her. When she finally rose, she placed her pendant beside Alzira's cracked carving. The 2 shapes sat together, one wood, one stone, different, yet somehow woven. The following morning, Hekanak woke before the sun and stepped into the sanctuary. The basin of dust shimmered. He approached slowly, aware of a hum in his chest. Not a sound, but a pull. He knelt before the basin and for the first time in many days reached into it. The dust rose like smoke, swirling upward, curling around his wrist and forearm, then higher, touching his throat, his brow, his crown. He closed his eyes and saw not visions but a face. His own, but older, wiser, smiling, not from pride, from welcome. And then a single word, not spoken aloud but delivered into the marrow of his bones. "Begin." When he opened his eyes, the dust had settled. But something within him had risen. He turned to see the others entering quietly. Isara, Alser, Nenet, the woman from the west, the silent child, and others who had felt the moment arrive. There were no trumpets, no flames, no markings in the sky. Only breath, only stillness, only readiness. Hekanak walked to the second door. It no longer glowed, it opened. But instead of stars or light or corridors of memory, they saw something far simpler. A field, an open plain of soft golden grass, bending gently in the wind. A horizon with no walls. A sky so wide it could hold every name, every silence. They stepped through, one by one or side by side, not leaving the temple but bringing it with them. Because they now understood. The temple was not stone. The temple was not chamber or altar or ritual. The temple was the spiral that lived within. And wherever they walked with that spiral alive in them, the remembering would bloom. Not as knowledge, not as power, but as peace. The field stretched before them, vast and quiet, its golden grass moving in slow waves beneath the breath of an unseen wind. There were no roads, no markers, no signs of destination, only the endless horizon, gentle and inviting. But it was not emptiness that surrounded them. It was space. Space made sacred by the weight of presence. Hekanak stepped forward first, his feet sinking slightly into the warm earth. It was softer than the garden soil, rich with scent, not of decay, but of life becoming. He paused and closed his eyes, letting the air fill his lungs. It smelled like crushed fennel, rain that hadn't yet fallen, and something older than any memory, the scent of beginning. The others followed in silence. Azara walked beside him, her eyes wide, her breath steady. Her fingers grazed the tops of the grass as if they were harp strings. Behind her came Alsera, his hand resting gently on the carved pendant he now wore around his neck. Nenet, slower than the rest, moved with the care of one crossing sacred ground. The child walked barefoot, her face serene, her gaze always fixed on something just beyond what the others could see. They did not speak. Speech felt too small. The further they walked into the field, the more the world behind them dissolved. Not as though it had been lost, but as though it had been absorbed, returned to something whole. The temple, the river, the stone, all of it now moved within them. After what felt like both moments and days, they reached a rise in the land, a gentle hill, not high, but enough to change the view. And at its crest, they paused. Before them lay a circle, a ring of standing stones, weathered and pale, arranged with such quiet precision that it seemed as if the wind had placed them there one at a time. They were not large, but they pulsed with presence. Around their base grew short wildflowers, lavender, ochre, and silver. The air shimmered slightly above the center, like heat on stone, though no heat pressed upon them. Without instruction, the group formed a circle outside the ring, each taking a place as if returning to a seat once left behind. No chants were spoken, no rites invoked. They simply sat and listened. The wind grew still, the grass bowed lower, the stones seemed to lean inward. Then slowly, the shimmer at the center of the ring thickened. It folded inward, then outward, as if breathing, and within that breath, light began to form. Not harsh, not radiant, but soft, the color of smoke at dawn or dreams just before waking. The light resolved into a shape. At first it was formless, like mist curling around memory, but then it became her, the child. Not as she had been, but as she had always been. Her form was woven from the same shimmer as the field itself, not separate, not apart, but focused. She looked not older, not changed, only clearer, as though she had stepped not forward, but inward. Her eyes passed over each of them, not in recognition, but in welcome. Then she spoke, not with her mouth, but with her presence. The spiral is complete. Hikanacht felt the words as warmth in his chest, expanding, but completion is not ending, it is unfolding. She walked to the center of the circle and placed her hands upon the ground. Where her palms touched, the earth darkened, not burned, not marked, simply deepened in hue as though remembering its own root. Each of you carries a thread, not of fate, not of prophecy, but of remembering. Around the circle, the wind began to move again, gently, slowly, in time with breath. You are not meant to stay. The wind rose. You are meant to carry. The wildflowers bent with the current. The light above her dimmed, but her form remained. Wherever your feet fall, the field will follow. Not in grass, not in stone, but in rhythm. And then she stepped back. Her form dissolved, not like smoke, but like song, a melody finishing its phrase and resting in the space it leaves behind. The shimmer faded, the wind stilled, and the silence that followed was not absence, it was blessing. They rose without speaking. One by one, they touched the ground where she had placed her hands, not to mark it, but to carry it. And then, as if summoned by that final touch, a path appeared. Not etched, not carved, but visible. A soft trail through the grass, curving gently out of the field and into the world beyond. They did not hesitate. Hekanacht turned first, his steps steady, no longer as priest, no longer as guide, but as bearer. Asara followed, her breath deep and even. Alzera walked beside Nanette, their arms brushing like leaves. The child, or what she had become, did not walk among them, but she walked within them. And as they stepped into the trail that had no end, the field behind them began to shimmer once more, not fading, becoming. They walked for hours, though none could say how many. The path moved as they moved, never straight, never winding, but always true. It was not marked by stone or color or change in terrain. It was marked by feeling. Wherever their feet pressed into the earth, the world responded with quietness, as if listening more closely to the weight of their presence. The field of gold gave way to low hills, where the grass grew taller and thicker, crowned with soft tassels that swayed without wind. Beyond the hills, a grove of slender trees emerged, their trunks smooth and pale, their leaves shaped like teardrops, catching the sunlight in flashes of silver. As the first among them passed between the trees, the sound changed. It was not birdsong, nor music, nor silence. It was a tone, low and steady, like the hum of a memory too deep for words. The trees seemed to carry it in their roots, and the ground beneath began to vibrate ever so gently with each step. Izara stopped beneath one of the trees and placed her palm against the bark. The vibration flowed up her arm, into her chest. "It remembers," she whispered. Alzera stepped beside her, listening. "So do we," he said. Beyond the grove, the trail widened. It opened into a valley cradled between two long, rolling ridges, where the sun poured down like honey over the land. At the center of the valley stood a structure, not a temple, not a house, but something between. It was built from earth and shaped by hand, low and circular, with a roof made of woven branches and a single spiral carved into the threshold. They did not speak as they approached. The door stood open. Inside, the space was cool and dim. A single skylight let in the sun, and through it, dust motes danced like falling stars. The air was rich with the smell of dried herbs and fresh clay. In the center of the room there was no altar, only a shallow pit filled with smooth stones, each etched with marks not of words, but of gestures. Swirls, lines, ripples. Hekanach knelt beside the stones. He picked one up, and as he turned it over in his hand, he felt a story rise within him, not in images or language, but in mood. A memory that was not his own. A sadness shaped like water. A joy wide as sky. Others joined him, lifting stones gently, cradling them as one cradles the face of someone remembered after a long absence. "This is not a place," Ninette murmured. "It's a witness," Izara said. They stayed there through the afternoon, not as guests, not as travelers, but as something older, those who had returned not to be taught, but to offer presence. By evening, a fire was lit in the center of the structure. No wood was burned. The flame rose from a basin of stone, fed by breath alone. Each took turns sitting beside it, speaking not aloud, but inwardly. And as they did, the fire responded, flickering taller, bending toward each speaker, as if in recognition. When the stars emerged overhead, they stepped outside together. The sky was vast, cloudless, and full. Hekanach lay on the grass, his hands behind his head, his eyes lost in constellations. Around him, the others did the same. The valley cradled them in silence. And then the stars began to shift. Not all at once, just one at first, then another. Not movement, but transformation. The constellations did not disappear. They unfolded. The hunter became a spiral. The river became a door. The lion became a seed. And as they watched, they remembered that these stars were not far. They were within. Each breath brought them closer to that truth. And as they drifted into sleep beneath the sky that sang without sound, no one feared what came next. Because now they understood. They were not walking toward the sacred. They were walking as it. And every step they took returned the world to itself. Dawn crept into the valley like a whispered secret, pale and golden, brushing the tips of the grass and the curved roof of the earthen dwelling with gentle light. The fire in the stone basin had gone out sometime in the night, but its warmth lingered in the air, woven into the breath of those who had slept around it. None had dreamed, or if they had, the dreams were not separate from waking. They awoke not with the feeling of returning, but with the sensation of continuing something they had always been part of. Hekanach sat up first, his body still, his face calm. Beside him, Izara stirred. She stretched her arms to the sky, not to shake off sleep, but to greet the light. Alzer remained lying in the grass, eyes open, watching the clouds move with reverent slowness. Ninette, already awake, had taken to walking the edge of the valley, barefoot, letting the dew wet his soles, collecting small plants he recognized not by name, but by memory. They gathered again in the circle, just as the sun crested the eastern ridge. No one called them. No bell sounded. Yet they came, drawn not by duty but by the rhythm now alive within them, a rhythm that echoed the spiral, the pulse of the remembering. The center of the circle had changed. The basin of stones was still there, but now it was surrounded by smaller spirals traced into the earth. Some new, others that seemed to have been there long before they arrived, as if the land itself had once spoken the same language, then fallen silent, waiting for someone to answer. Hekanach stepped forward and knelt by the basin. He picked up a stone, this one marked with a single curve, like a wave caught in the moment before it broke. He pressed it to his forehead, and then he spoke, not in Egyptian, not in any tongue known to script or scroll, but in sound. Along this low tone that grew into a wordless phrase, a hum, a chant, a song that seemed to rise from the marrow rather than the mouth. The sound filled the space, moved through the grass, lifted into the branches of the nearby trees. It wasn't loud, but it reached far. And then Izara joined him. Her voice wrapped around his, higher, clearer, like water spilling over stone. Then Alzer, then Ninette. One by one, all present added their voice, not in harmony, but in alignment. Each sound unique, each tone held with care, until the valley itself seemed to hum with them. It was not music for listening, it was music for remembering. The sun rose higher, and the spiral carved into the doorway of the dwelling glowed faintly, not with fire, but with reflection. Light caught it from just the right angle and scattered it back into the grass, where it danced like dust in wind. They sang until the song ended itself. No one stopped it. It simply finished, like a wave folding back into the sea. Silence followed, but it was not the silence of absence. It was the silence of presence, complete, whole, waiting. Hekanak stood and looked to the others. We are no longer keepers, he said. We are seeds. Asara smiled softly. And seeds are not meant to stay. They began to prepare, not to return, but to scatter. Each person gathered what they needed. Not much. A small bundle of dried herbs, a carved stone, a single scroll. Nothing heavy. Nothing that could not be offered to another. They would not travel as a group. They would go in different directions, guided not by destination but by feeling. Alcer would walk east, toward the place of his first memory, a hill near the mouth of the river, where children once danced in circles without knowing why. Isara would move north, to a port city she had never seen but dreamed of often, a place of thresholds where people arrived and departed without knowing what they sought. Nenet would return to the desert, to the places where silence pressed hardest, where the spiral could be carved not in stone but in wind. And Hekanak, he would follow the river, not upstream or down, but with it, letting its rhythm lead him. Before they parted, they sat together one last time. No ceremony, no farewell, only presence. They placed the basin of stones at the center of the dwelling. They left the fire unlit. They walked out, one by one. The valley did not close behind them. It remained, open, breathing, alive. And somewhere beyond the hills, the wind carried a single hum, the echo of a spiral turning through the world once more. Hekanak followed the river, not in haste, nor with destination, but with devotion, as if each bend of water, each hollow reed, each bank where dragonflies hovered and papyrus swayed, offered a syllable of a language long remembered but rarely spoken. The Nile did not move quickly, but it moved truly, and so he mirrored it. Some days he walked until the sun lowered itself behind distant trees, and some days he simply sat in the shade, watching the water pass, letting his breath fall in time with the current. He carried with him nothing but a small satchel of herbs, a reed flute carved by Alzeh, and a single stone from the valley, smooth, dark, and marked with a gentle spiral. He kept it wrapped in cloth, not to protect it, but to hold its presence with care. It was not a symbol, it was a rhythm, and he felt it each time he laid his hand over the bundle. The people he met along the way noticed him before he spoke. They felt his quiet. Fishermen offered him places to sit without asking where he had come from. Children watched him with wide eyes and followed him as far as their feet were allowed. Elders nodded from doorways, sensing in his gait something familiar, not in the way of recognition, but of remembering. In one village, he helped repair the broken edge of a well. In another, he sat by a dying tree and sang a song with no words until the wind returned to its branches. In a wide open field, he placed his hand upon the earth and listened for so long that birds landed beside him without fear. He never named himself. He never claimed wisdom. He never preached. He simply was. And in that being, the spiral turned. Stories began to pass between villages, carried by breath and footstep. A man had come who walked without need, who listened without question. Some called him a priest. Some called him a dream walker. Some said he was no man at all, but a song left behind by the river itself. One night, near the delta's edge, he found a small gathering. Not a temple, not a village, just a fire, surrounded by figures who sat in a circle, their faces lit not with expectation, but with stillness. They welcomed him without words, offering a place at the edge of the circle and a bowl of warm lentils thick with spice and steam. He sat, accepted the food, and joined their silence. At the center of the group sat an old woman, her eyes clouded but unblinking. She wore no markings, no robe, nothing to suggest rank, and yet the others shifted slightly in rhythm with her breath, as if they drew from it a subtle order. After a long while, she spoke. "You've carried the spiral far." Hekanak looked into her eyes, though they did not look back. "I have walked with it," he replied. She nodded. "And it has walked with you." She reached into a small pouch at her side and pulled out something wrapped in linen. With slow hands, she unfolded the cloth and revealed a stone, identical in size and shape to his own, but marked with a different spiral, tighter, more complex, like a song that had spun itself deeper. "I was given this when I was very young," she said. "I did not understand it then, but it sang to me, in dreams, in sorrow, in silence. Heknek laid his own stone beside hers. The two spirals faced one another like companions long parted, no longer needing to speak. Another figure in the circle, a younger woman with hair the color of ash, leaned forward and added her own stone, marked not with a spiral, but with a line that turned upon itself, a path interrupted and then resumed. More stones followed, some smooth, some rough, some carved, some natural, all laid in a slow, deliberate rhythm until the firelight danced over a full circle of memory, shaped not by names but by presence. Hekanak looked at them, his heart full not with understanding but with stillness. "This is the temple," he whispered. The old woman smiled. It always was. That night they sang, not all at once. One voice would begin, a tone, a wordless phrase, and another would join, not to harmonize, but to echo, to respond, to remember. The sound moved like water, bending and turning, rising and falling. It was not music for the ear, but for the soul. And in its center, the fire pulsed gently, as if warmed by breath alone. As dawn approached, the singing ceased, not from exhaustion, but because it was complete. Hekanak stood and faced the east. The first light touched the river, and he knew that his journey was not ending. It was seeding. He turned to those gathered and bowed, not low, but deeply, like a reed bending in strong wind. Then he walked on, his feet steady, the spiral turning not behind him, but within. The final stretch of the river shimmered beneath the sun's rising gaze, its waters broadening and slowing as they approached the mouth where land yielded to the endlessness of sea. Hekanak walked its bank alone now, not out of solitude, but from a fullness that needed no company. The earth beneath his feet felt warm, familiar, as though he had circled not a path but a truth, the kind that lives not in direction but in return. The land here was quiet. Villages were scattered wide, their homes low and weather-worn, their people slow-spoken and steady-eyed. Smoke from morning fires curled into the air like softened prayers. A woman standing over a cooking pot met his gaze with a nod. A boy leading goats along a ridge paused and gave him a slice of pomegranate without needing to ask his name. No one here needed names, only presence. Hekanak reached a place where the land opened wide, a low, grassy basin where the river bent one final time before yielding to the horizon. It was neither marked nor claimed. No walls stood, no altars waited. And yet, as his feet touched its edge, he felt the spiral stir within him. This was where he would pause, not end. Pause. He sat beside the water, pulling the cloth-wrapped stone from his satchel and laying it gently before him. The spiral etched upon it had faded slightly, worn by the touch of hands and time, but it still held its rhythm. He placed his fingers upon it, closed his eyes, and exhaled. The breeze that rose smelled of salt and earth and sun-warmed grass. It played across his skin like a familiar song. He saw not visions, but moments. Izara teaching children how to listen to silence. Alzira carving spirals into driftwood for travelers to find. Nenet, his scrolls spread wide on the floor of a desert hut, now a gathering place for those who carried dreams they could not name. Others, too, faces he'd never seen, walking through forests and over stone bridges and down dusty roads, each carrying the same quiet light. The remembering had spread, not as flame, not as flood, as seed, carried in silence, planted in presence, watered with breath. Hekanak reached into his satchel one final time. He drew out the flute Alzir had carved for him, smoothed by the oils of his hands over many days and nights. He lifted it to his lips and played a single note, low, round, and steady. Then another, then a phrase. It was not music meant for others. It was a conversation with the river, the land, the breath between. The spiral turned in sound. As he played, birds gathered in the low branches nearby. A fox settled in the tall grass. The reeds by the river leaned inward. Everything listened, not to the song but to the presence within it. When the final note fell into silence, the world did not speak, it breathed, and Hekanak felt the spiral within him settle. Not close, not finish, but rest. He lay back upon the earth, the sun warm upon his chest, the stone at his side. He watched the clouds drift over the mouth of the river where the Nile met the sea, where sweet water became salt, where journey became tide. And as his eyes softened, as his body folded into the breath of the land, he smiled, not for having arrived, but for having remembered. The spiral would turn again, elsewhere, in another time, in another form, and someone, somewhere would pause in stillness and feel it stir.